Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one, there are significant developments taking place north of Pokrovsk. The Russians are completely dismantling the Ukrainian defensive line north of the city. The Russians have made two different pushes, each covering 9 kilometers deep into Ukrainian lines. At the same time, the Russians also significantly expanded the gray zone where their forces are present but do not have control over the positions yet. These positions have expanded both in the northern direction but also in the western direction, bypassing Orodinske and reaching the outskirts of Vasilivka and Rishina in the northern flank of Pokrovsk at the last supply lines leading into the city. Taking a look at each of them, the Russian push beyond Rudinske has been mainly along the railways, which provide a lot of cover for their infantry. The Russians advance along these railways, putting all of these fortified positions in the gray zone and pushing all the way to the outskirts of the settlements. These are Russian infantry that are not very numerous so far. Again, the Russians made a completely new tactic once they reached the northern flank of Pokrovsk, and that is rather than launching combined strike advances, where they launched armored vehicles, tanks, drone coverage, infantry, air cover, all of these things. Instead, what they are doing is that they are advancing with just infantry and drones. What they're doing is that they want to infiltrate as deeply as possible into the Ukrainian back lines and clear the way for the main force to then move forward and capture these positions. These tactics have actually been used in the southern flank of Pokrovsk as well. The Russian capture of several settlements here along the highway between Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka were captured through this method, where one or two Russian soldiers were advancing towards a settlement and were used as a base to cover for drone fire, allowing them to enter into these villages. Once they enter, they clear the way for the main force to enter and consolidate these positions. This allowed them to capture several settlements here in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, and with the success they saw using the method in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, they were using it at a much larger scale on the northern flank, where we're seeing developments such as these, where Russian soldiers infiltrated deep behind Ukrainian lines and found a way through the defensive lines to then move through with their main force to consolidate these positions, finding several fortified positions almost completely empty, allowed the Russians to quickly gain control of them, both on the eastern and western flanks of Kucherev Yar, allowing them to reach the settlements in the back, such as Vesele and Solochi Kolodyesi, where they are working on establishing a foothold in the southern and western parts of these settlements, expand their zone of control and gain control of them, consolidating their positions along the main road for a long, deep supply line leading into the rear, cutting off the road between Dobropillia and Kramatorsk. This would leave with just one highway, the Kramatorsk-Dobropillia wide highway that connects the eastern and western parts of the Donetsk region through the Donetsk region itself. This significantly increases travel time between the Russian and Ukrainian positions through the Ukrainian supply lines. According to some reports, Russian soldiers have already reached all the way deep into Dobropillia. However, this has yet to be confirmed, unlike the developments in the north. What we're seeing is that the Russians are launching a deep offensive in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. The objective is to gain control over Rodinske, Dobropillia, and Ryshine here in the northern flank and western flank of the city to completely encircle the city of both Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. The fighting has reportedly already begun within Rodinske in the south, while Belitsky has been completely bypassed by the Russian forces. The Russians made a slow advance moving forward towards Belitsky and Rodinske, to which the Ukrainians started establishing defensive lines. While they were establishing these lines, the Russians found the gap between their defenses and took complete advantage of it, capturing these 24 square kilometers here to the north. That is besides the gray zones that have been significantly expanded. The Russians also managed to gain full control over Perechine following weeks of fighting over both the fortified positions north of the town and the town itself. With this, the Russians are just a few kilometers from the outskirts of Kościantynivka on the eastern flank. The developments taking place here on the eastern flank of Kościantynivka are aimed at opening up a road towards the city itself, while at the same time expanding the zone of control on the northern flank of it to operationally encircle the city. We're seeing the developments both in the western and eastern flanks. With control over Predishina, the Russians will continue the offensive operations towards Chervone and Stinky, then onwards towards Popasne. This will allow the Russians to operationally encircle the city, where we could see similar developments or an extension of the developments taking place north of Pokrovsk. The Russians will likely look to gain full control over the Ukrainian positions in between Pokrovsk and Kościantynivka. If the Russians manage to gain control over Pokrovsk and Mirnorod prior to the operational encirclement of Kościantynivka or during the operational encirclement of Kościantynivka, the Russians will continue their operational encirclement to not just include Kościantynivka and Druskivka, but expand it all the way towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, gaining control over the western highways of the Donetsk region, significantly expanding the zone of control along the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region, as well as the Donetsk and Kharkiv region, to attack these cities from the rear. We are already seeing, while there are still fortified positions, the Russians are able to exploit gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. Beyond that, there are barely any remaining, to which the Russians can significantly increase the speed at which they are advancing. If they're able to gain full control over the remaining defensive positions north of Pokrovsk and gain control over Pokrovsk as a logistical hub, the Russians will be able to expand the zone of operations all the way to the outskirts of the Donetsk region and to the rear of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the west. While the Ukrainian forces that are situated in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, there is a brigade administering this area. According to Deep State Map, they are complaining about this brigade as the situation is quite chaotic. I quote Deep State Map to be saying, "Currently, the enemy has managed through constant pressure with a superior number of infantry to advance into the settlements of Kucherev Yar and Solochi Kolodyasi, where they are accumulating forces for further success. Along their route, the Muscovites are trying to establish their positions and consolidate their presence in the area. Also from Kucherev Yar through the groves, the enemy has infiltrated the settlement of Vesele and is accumulating forces there as well. In the last day, about 24 of these scoundrels have been recorded in this village. So we're seeing dozens of Russian soldiers in the direction of Vesele and Solochi Kolodyasi, as well as the southern positions here in the direction of Kucherev Yar, where the Russians are building up their forces and increasing the amount of soldiers present in these settlements. Deep State Map then goes on to say, at the same time, the enemy does not stop at what has been achieved and continues to develop their success in the direction of the Dobropillia-Kramatorsk highway, being recorded in the area of Novovodiane and Petrivka, which is the settlement here, Novovodiane and Petrivka further north. The situation is quite chaotic, as the enemy, having found gaps in the defense, is infiltrating deep, trying to quickly consolidate, accumulate for further advancement. While some individuals in the command of a certain brigade either do not understand the full depth of the problem or present the situation as controlled, in which everyone was killed, everyone was stopped. However, the soldiers themselves who are holding the defense there are trying to understand what is happening, disagree with this. The beginning of the route to Dobropillia and logistics for the enemy started with fire controlled by drones. Currently, the enemy has found places to physically lay this path, fully aware of the consequences that will arise after achieving their goals. The limitations of the supplies going to and from Pokrovsk to the Soviet-Kościantynivka line. The enemy has already predetermined endpoints they must reach, and today they are implementing their plan, trying to fully occupy Solochi, Kolodyasi, Kucherev Yar, Vesele, and other settlements. After final consolidation and accumulation, there will be a mandatory attempt to move deeper into the territory, and drone crews will be brought in, complicating the reconstruction of alternative logistics and holding surrounding positions for the defense forces. With such a development of events, if it does not change, we may face the moment when Dobropillia falls faster than Pokrovsk. Dobropillia being this city on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, which has a pre-war population of 28,000 civilians. We see an industrial area, there are apartment complex areas, and an additional industrial area. It is about half the size of Milorad/Pokrovsk average between the two cities, and just short of the city of Avdiivka in terms of population. That is to show the significance of the city here in the northern flank of Pokrovsk. It is also the last city of its size in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, beyond that of the Sloviansk-Shentinivka line. It means a Russian capture of Dobropillia will allow them to establish that as a logistical hub for offensive operations going in the northwestern, northeastern, and western directions, as well as strengthening the operational encirclement of Pokrovsk if Dobropillia is captured prior to the capture of Pokrovsk. At the same time, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Torsk in the northern parts and central parts of the town, except for the very northern outskirts and the very southern outskirts, where fighting continues over the fortified positions within the Serebrenski forest area along the outskirts of Torsk and the fish farm area in the northern outskirts of the settlement. While the Russians are starting fightings across the river line here, the Serebrensk river line, into Sarishne, Russians are attempting to gain a foothold alongside the river line to fight over the fortified positions located on the crossings themselves. Gain control over these crossings and enter into Sarishne will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations on the western bank of the Serebrensk river line and significantly expand their offensive operations towards Liman, with the combined offensive operations on the western flank to cut off the supply lines, the northern flank to enter additional points through the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, both in the region of Sarishne and Stavki, and the eastern flanks to enter into Sarishne and gain control over the Serebrenski forest area, are all at gaining full control over Liman. Further north of this, the Russians managed to gain control over Zeleny High, as we see with this located footage, with the Russians waving the flag within the central parts of the town. Gaining full control over Zeleny High allows the Russians to develop offensive operations in the direction of Uporova, here in the eastern bank of the Uskal river line, where we're seeing that the Russians are developing offensive operations, storming Kupiansk on the western bank of the Uskal river line, gain control over the northern parts of the Uskal river line. With the offensive operations in the direction of Borova, the Russians are expanding these developments all along the Uskal river line from Kupiansk in the north to Liman in the south to gain full control over the river line, which will cover the northern flank of Sloviansk. The Russians here continue their offensive operations all across the Donetsk region to gain full control of it. The Russians are mainly targeting Pokrovsk as their main objective. Secondary objectives include Kostiantynivka and Liman, as well as Siversk to the east. These four main areas, Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, Siversk, and Liman, are all areas that either significantly bolster the logistical situation for the Russian forces, limits the defensive capability of the Ukrainians, or significantly increases the offensive capabilities of the Russians, if not all three. What we are witnessing is a true local collapse of the Ukrainian positions here in the western parts of the Donetsk region, which can spiral out of control for the Ukrainian forces, especially if the Russians double down on these offensive operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.